Thank you so much. I get so easily moved these days after I broke my hand, so it's kind of touching to hear your introduction and seeing things in perspective. I was here in Prague 21 years ago on the IIPF then as a very young, very nervous PhD student discussing a paper by somebody I'd never known, I didn't know how to do that, and who now tells me that it's not working?
Microphone.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's working now. Oh, wow. It's the magic when you just do this and things happen, right? I was just telling you when I was here like 21 years ago at the IIPF in 2003, as a very nervous young PhD student, had no idea how things worked, was going to do my first ever discussion, and apparently the paper I presented by somebody I had no idea who was, tells me that I apparently didn't like the paper that much and is still bearing grudges towards me. The current president, Wojciech Kopczuk, he won the, I can't remember that I was that nasty or like I think it was a great paper, but he also won the prize that year for that paper. But later, he can't have been too cross with me because we started working together. I've been working together for 15 years. So going to conferences can actually shape your lives afterwards. So I'm super glad to be here. It's an amazing conference and venue, and I'm so thank you for the organizers, the scientific and the local. It's a massive undertaking, and I will now get back to work. I will do a bit of different keynote this time. I'll just give you some things that I wish somebody would have told me when I started up like more than 20 years ago. So I didn't have to do all the errors and trial and failing myself. So I will just take a step back and talk about a bit more what is dissemination and impact, and then get over to how we measure the unobservable, which Ron, you didn't hear me when I said that. I was like really moved and so thankful for such a nice introduction. It's good to see things in perspective sometimes, because we just work, and we never lift and look back. And then I'm going to try to talk about how do we measure financial wealth, offshore financial wealth, what is it, and how has it developed over time? And then try to get at, is it now shifting to other types of wealth, if you want to hide something? And then I will talk a bit more about the practicalities, like working on these issues, trying to do new things, use new data. There are challenges that you may not think about when you start out. So I'd just like to give you some tips of what to think about and keep in mind. Why are we economists? Or more like why are we economists doing economic research, right? Okay, we're curious, we want to learn new things, but we also want to change the world, don't we? We want to do things that has an impact, changes the world a little bit, that it has meaning. But how do we do that when most people in the real life thinks as us as kind of esoteric in what we're doing? Like the journal. We want to publish for our job market, we want to have a job, we want to publish nicely, but we also want our research to be used and heard and be useful. And how do we do that in a good way? So I've now finally managed to set up a research center, basically incorporating some of the lessons that I've learned over time, and I have a lot from my Skattefoss people here, and I'm just so happy, so great to be here and see people not being alone anymore, how you build rock, get funding, get great people, and now we are this new center, we are working with closing 100 people around the world, almost 80 projects, and so many amazing people, and we are really, really doing what I want to do. It's changing the world a little bit, number by number. Because numbers make headlines. Headlines make policymakers pay attention, and it also makes people pay attention and force policymakers to do the changes that are necessary. So how do we get around this? Okay, first you need numbers, you need information. So how much taxes are dodged and how are they dodged? Showing up, we do a lot of great work. There's so many people doing great work here. I'm just telling you, I'm not gonna give a literature overview because I'm so afraid of forgetting anybody, because there's so many new things coming up all the time. So I'm just going to talk about experiences and my things, and then I'm looking forward to seeing so many cool presentations here later. So first we need numbers. How are taxes dodged and to which extent? Just showing how it's done. But the next step is, why do we care? Like, why should policymakers care if like there's tax evasion going on or tax avoidance or wherever? Like, we have to show them, okay, these are real effects. What are the real effects? Do they affect like production, productivity, investments, employment? Like, why do we care? And then what do we do about it? And then we have to go in the nitty-gritty things, like the devil is in the law text. We can talk about principles as economists. We can talk about, like, I've been on government committees, and then we say, what we do is say, this is how the tax system should be like. And then we have it over the report, and it's up to the Ministry of Finance to implement it. And then there's so many things going wrong in that process, like, how do you make the law text? There's so many things going from that theory model, how a tax system should be in a very like a closed economy. We have like 2 periods, we have like one agent, and just look at one tax at a time. When you implement that, then all the taxes and the world are together, there's so many things going wrong and so many opportunities. If you just have one word wrong in the law, that opens up for avoidance and evasion and like using the loopholes. But then it's not even enough, because how are the tax administration able to implement the laws that are made? Like, how do you have the able to collect the data? So when you make laws, you should think about like a tax principle or tax rules. You should think about in the like the life cycle of that, and think about when you write the law text, how is the tax admin going to control and audit and implement that in a very easily manner, and how are people going to comply with the rules? Because making rules that aren't able to comply with or like enforce, they make no sense. To do this, we can't just be economists, and we have to be humble and learn from other professions. And we really, really need lawyers to help us understand the law. We need accountants to help us to understand the books and the accounting data. We work with accounting data, but do we really understand what's in the variables? So we should be very humble and learn from accountants. That's why I'm so happy that there's an accounting given here, because we need to have interaction. We need to have people from finance. We need to have people from IT. Like, how do you implement rules in a tax system very efficiently? We should think about that when we also make the rules. Okay, I'm very enthusiastic about this, but this is basically what we're doing at Skatteforsk, all this circle of life, as I call it. And I really hope that we can collaborate with many of you to change the world, slightly bit by bit. But how do you disseminate, right? So usually I've just been think, okay, I write a paper, maybe I write an op-ed, I give a presentation with an op-ed, maybe an interview in the papers, then people should know, the policymakers should know, right? They're so far from our papers to the real world. And we see that numbers are floating around a lot. I'm going to tell you, when we collaborated with journalists and got country estimates about hidden wealth in Dubai, people contacted me from emerging economies, civil society, like they wanted to know more about their country. We want to hold our governments accountable, and we need numbers to compare that with other countries and to see can implicit evidence on corruption, and like numbers are power. And we had the numbers, they were in the appendix, but how do you make them seen and heard and available, easily available? So then we went to the Norwegian NORAD, Norwegian Agency for Development, and started a collaboration of bringing numbers out there. So we made together with in the EU Tax Observatory, we made a web page. So please go and use the Atlas of the Offshore World. They were taking like rigorous data from research-based data, documented in the well one, and make them easily accessible with material that you can easily use. So I'm going to use data from there and show how this can be used going forward. We are also going to make films and teaching material, so please use our resources. And there's also, based on that, we made this policy report. Like we took based on the data and made a report and saying, okay, how does tax evasion look today? Like, what have we learned? What's the status? What's working? What's not working? The fight against tax evasion. What's the way going forward? Trying to get very easily policy advice based on that. Getting back to the topic, how do you get these data? How do we use, like, yes, we have great admin data, wonderful in many countries, and especially Norway, wonderful admin data. Over a long time, I have the whole population back to 1993, like firms and individuals. But how do you get at the extent of tax avoidance or tax evasion? Because remember, the data that we have is basically based on admin data, like tax data, so we know the same as the taxman does. So how do we then quantify the tax the extent of tax evasion, and also when it goes across borders. That's the main problem. And then we started working with journalists, which there are like challenges, very big resource and challenges and pitfalls. I'll talk a bit more of that later. And I also want to raise a big flag for everybody who wants to do that. Remember to comply with GDPR and ethical guidelines. I cannot stress that enough. If we are going to be doing research that people can believe in, we also need to comply with all these guidelines, and it's a lot of work. So it's too much for one person, so we have to team up with different ones. But doing that in a good way also gives you a base foundation to go forward. Offshore financial wealth, what is that? Well, going back to an infographic we have easily downloadable on the Atlas of the Offshore World. I'm really proud of that product. So, and a lot of people in the room here has been working a lot to get that up and running. Like as an economist, I never thought that I would be negotiating with web designers in French for setting up web pages. So professors these days, we do a lot of different things, not only normal research, but this part of the job, if you want to get things out there. So basically, offshore financial wealth is basically wealth that you own abroad. You can own it directly in banks, or you can own it through like holding companies, through other countries. And the more layers you have between you and the money, the more difficult it is to observe, also for the tax admin. But then numbers isn't enough. Like you also want to convince yourself and policymakers, why do you care? Like why should we care about offshore wealth of people having money abroad? Well, for first, it's easier to hide money. It's not illegal to have money abroad at all. Like remember that, we're not talking about everything is evasion, but it makes it much more easy to hide who is really owning it. And now we're talking about estimates about like 12 trillion US dollars. Like it's kind of the amounts I was thinking about. We know when we're small, the biggest number you can think about is 100 million, billion, something like that. You want to say, we're talking about amounts that doesn't make sense. But what we do is, if you see it related to the world GDP, it's about corresponds to 12% of world GDP. And it's been pretty stable over time. So the amount of wealth that households own abroad has been pretty stable over time. And I'll see this is also an estimate on this. So here is the total, it's been around 10 to 12% over time. This is the total, but we also see that here's a table showing where that wealth is located. Switzerland is the light blue, used to be the main location for offshore wealth. Has been less secrecy and difficult to hide, so we see that they're less important. And then the Asian tax havens are growing in importance. So we see that over time. This is kind of building on the work that I did with Gabriel Zuckerman and Nils Johannessen, and it's been updated with more years by our great colleagues at the EU Tax Observatory. Who owns this wealth then in the country? Like what we have done is like we were able to break it down on a country by country level to show who owns it. And if you go to the Atlas, you can also have make a video and show how it evolves over time. This is the numbers from 2022. And we see that the darker blue a country is, the more offshore wealth people in that country owns relative as a percentage of GDP. And we see, you can find your own country here. So there's a development over time in this. Some countries change. But it still doesn't tell us about who owns this wealth in the country. So who owns, we can see the country distribution, we can download data on country level and go and play with that, but who owns it within the country? And traditionally, the saying has been, and this is what tax administrations have been working from, the poor evade and the rich avoid. So the normal guy is the one who cheats on taxes and pays his painter under the table and don't report all income. But the rich guys, they utilize the law, so we can't touch them. So it's all legal. They're very clever and use advisors, but they use firms and holding companies, but there's no use going in and auditing them. But that was, and then also, so this is collaborated by data we have from a big Danish randomized audits, showing the way we're able to distribute, show the tax gap across the population. We see here people are ranked, this is households, are ranked by their wealth, household wealth here, from the poorest to the richest, and we see it's pretty stable, around 2 to 5% across the distribution of wealth. So not more like evasion across within the wealthy. There were fewer. One of the problems here is that the coverage at the top is pretty small. So, but there's nothing. It seems like it's pretty stable across the population. But this is because they only can observe what's in Denmark. This is based on the Danish audit. So what you can't observe is the offshore wealth. So if the offshore wealth is, and the offshore tax evasion is not equally distributed, this will affect our understanding on the tax gap distributed. So then with Gabriel Zuckerman and Niels Johannessen, we had this very long project where we collaborated with tax administrations in Scandinavia, got data on all individuals over time. We got the randomized audit data from Denmark. We also got amnesty data for Norway and Sweden. From Norway, we got it from the tax admin. From Sweden, we didn't, but we got our indirect access through the journalists who have gotten it on information and request questions. We used the Panama Papers, and then we also Swiss leaks, where we basically got a snapshot into all account holders of the Swiss branch of the bank HSBC. So we could actually see who held accounts there, and what's more importantly, we were able to match that with the tax records. So you can see who of those who were tax residents in Scandinavia had an account in Switzerland. We could see how much, and we could also, with collaboration with the tax admin, see whether or not I had reported that account. And it turned out that 90% had not reported it. This was for 2006 and 2017. So the majority of foreign owners had not reported their Swiss bank account. So we can use this as an estimate of the tax gap of the offshore foreign wealth. Using that and looking that the foreign wealth was distributed, the majority of the foreign wealth, offshore wealth, was held by the very rich. This gives a totally different picture of the tax gap. So we merged this to the admin data, and we do this. Gabriel just said, oh yeah, let's just make a small model to estimate how much everybody should have paid in taxes, each individual in all the Scandinavian countries. I was just laughing first, and then I started crying when I understood he meant what he was saying, suggesting, because it was a huge amount of work making this tax calculator for each individual. But we managed to do it. And then we see that the tax gap, this is the blue, is from the offshore wealth, 25% tax gap at the very top. But this is just because it's unobserved. So the tax admin, they make their audits based on this red, but they fully ignored what was hidden abroad. So this has been an eye-opener also. So it's not like now we could change the saying to saying the poor evade and the rich evade even more. So it's been changing also how tax admins do their audits. But this was in 2006. And over time, we have had more and more information exchange. And the OECD has the CRS. More than 100 countries are now exchanging banking information. And you have the FATCA in the US, where the US is, of course, not a member of the CRS. They just say all banks should report every US citizen's bank accounts to us, but they don't report to anybody else. So that's also, but we have then the FATCA and the CRS. And everybody's saying now the problem with hidden bank accounts is solved. Well, it is to some extent, if things are reported and used correctly. I'll get back to that. But if we just look at the blue is the same line I showed you. The total estimate of this is around 10 to 12% of GDP is held, like wealth corresponding to that, is held by individuals abroad. And then using what we have known, like this Norwegian and Danish estimate of like 90% was untaxed, at around 2006, we see that but by evidence, collaborating evidence for different countries, we'll have some similar numbers, but we also see that transparency has increased. So the orange line is our estimate from this global tax evasion report on the current hidden wealth. So this was basically what we estimate was the hidden wealth before. And now with all these information exchange agreements and implementation, we now estimate it's around 30%. And not 90%. We were a bit quick when making the report. So we have untaxed offshore wealth is estimated at 30%. I would say unknown, because it has shown like audits and like national, like all kind of spotlight on these processes have shown that even if the tax admin gets the data, they're not always able to use them correctly. One of the main reasons is that they're bilaterally exchanged, nobody oversees, nobody have overseen on the total thing, but also they are matched by names. So getting back to your question about who evades, Ron, I could easily hide an account with my name. Like, I guess like there are very few of you who could write my name correctly if you were asked to do that. So if you have very weird letters, that's a very good advantage if you want to hide money, because they're matched on and they will never be able to write it correctly. So yeah, so there's like a lot of practical challenges there. And they have a project together with Jakob Myte, Lisa Kasi, and Barbara Stage, looking at indirect evidence, because one of the main challenges is that we don't get any data about the CRS. It's complete secrecy. So you have the irony that you want to have this, like we have great transparency now. Now the tax admin are getting all information abroad. But there are these conditions being joining this that they're not supposed to share data with anybody. And then there's a big distinction between data and statistics. If you want to work in this legal area, I learned that before. There's a difference between asking about data and asking about statistics. But OECD has not understood that difference. So even if you're not allowed to share data, the tax agreements say you're not allowed to share data with anybody outside, it's just used for tax purposes. I keep arguing that statistics isn't data, so you could share that, but that's also not going. So there's very little information about like aggregate on country by country level, even like the aggregate, how much is sent from and to each country, because it's total secrecy. That makes that we have to find indirect ways of trying to evaluate this, so looking at how capital flows between countries and how it's affected by these changes in legislation. And that's what we do here in this country. And what we actually find is that it seems when you look at the capital flowing back to Norway from tax havens, we can see there's a shift. There's much more capital flowing back to individual accounts from tax havens that are more compliant with the CRS, because they can use the reports on how many legislations the country implement, how it seems like we can make a proxy for how, because even if we say this is the agreement, everybody agree, how do you implement that at home? And how do you make sure that the banks are supposed to send this also implement at home? So we can see, we can divide countries in compliant and less compliant countries and see that. And it seems more effective that people take money home from tax havens that seem to be more compliant, so a bigger threat of being detected. But there's also this big, and the OECD gives out some statistics about the successfulness of this. But there seems to be some double counting. That's that's a challenge also for not giving statistics out even or sharing data, because then you aren't able to have this scrutinized by others to see, does this add up, and compare it with other available statistics. We are having a paper now in the other session here, where we are using penalty data from Norway, just digression. Jakob Brunstein and Johannes Scheurer are presenting as a joint paper. And then we were super happy to get tax data, penalty data from the Norwegian tax administration to use and analyze. And then we saw there's something strange here. These data don't seem to add up. And we asked a question about them. And then suddenly they realized there was a bug in their IT system. So they have to fix it. The meaning that, and then there's a lot of nervousness, we get new data, but it's a really good thing that we as researchers can help discover bugs in the statistics that they give out or the data they use for their own work, right? So it's very stressful when it happens, but that's the use of us using data and thinking critically and getting then better data from the administration. Okay, I'm getting off track here. But preliminary, that's a very difficult word. Preliminary work from Matt Cullen sitting over there. He is showing that when you look at the available data here on the CRS, trying to indirectly evaluate these areas, it seems like there's some double counting in the statistics one give out, meaning that the figures we had here, basing a lot on aggregate data, may be a bit optimistic. So it's like when you have to dig down in the quality control of the data available, you see that the correction has to be made. And that's the main problem here. Like, why do we have these big transparency pushes and there's no transparency on the effects on it? But assuming that this is working, okay, bank secrecy is dead, as has been said many times. Is the problem then solved? Well, like as everybody working with tax evasion and avoidance, you think it's kind of a bag that's leaking, right? You can hold and the sand is coming up, pouring out here, and you can try to take it, but there's something else coming somewhere else. So of course it's going to spill out somewhere else. And where do you go then? Well, real estate is not part of this information exchange. And many countries do not have registers or overview who owns real estate in their own country, like centralized registers. So that seems to there's like evidence, increasing evidence pointing towards more, if you want to hide money, you go into real estate abroad. You can also do it in Norway. We have also evidence in Norway. You can, even in Norway, you have one of the best, apparently, I thought, centralized registers, knowing where everybody, who owns every property, and who owns every company and all of that. But still there's difficulty. The more layers you have companies between the ownership, the more difficult it is for the tax admin to see through who is the real owner. And also, as journalists have shown, like we have a lot of properties owned by dead people. So who owns them really? So it's kind of an enforcement. So what is then offshore real estate? Basically, it is real estate that's owned abroad. This is also from the Atlas. Owned abroad, either directly or indirectly through firms. But you can also own it. You can have round tripping, which has also been shown here, like by colleagues in the UK, that UK citizens own UK properties, but it appears to be owned by foreigners because you round trip through another country and some trusts or whatever. So who really, and this is becoming an increasing security issue also from many countries. Like, who owns real estate? Who owns critical infrastructure? Who are the investors who buy up the sewage system, the harbors, the airports? Are they the companies? Who are owners behind the companies? And in this geopolitical situation, that's become an increasing security threat issue in many countries. And we also see that, like, you see properties from owners you don't know who is being bought up around military facilities and all of that. How do we get then to estimating the extent of ownership of wealth, hidden wealth in real estate when there are no centralized registers and it's really difficult to see across borders? Well, we work with journalists. So we've been collaborating with journalists, utilizing data that we got access to on all the owners of Dubai real estate through a leak. We started working in basically through all of COVID. The first was launched in 2022, and we also had now a second leak with even bigger, like consortium with more than 78, I think, media houses in more than 40 countries collaborating on this. And then the researchers were working on the data, estimating values and finding, like, affiliating where the owners come from, looking at the big picture. And the journalists are working at the same time looking at cases. That's very distinct. So I'm getting back to that, but also, so it's very like we have different roles. We work in parallel, but we don't work together. So the last note we had in May was this updated on Dubai. We had one note in working paper in 2022, and we had one now in 2024. So the thing is, we can, when we work with journalists, as when we work with here, we can present work in an early stage and discuss results. But I, as a researcher, cannot give anything to journalists, results or anything that isn't public when they use it. So whenever they're going to use results that we use, we put it online as a note, so that's available for everybody. But we can discuss it at an early stage and learn from each other. But we never discuss names. I'm going to present some of the work we're doing here, some of the processes, but I'm not going into the results because Blueberry will present this later. So I just going to show, I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to speak on behind the scenes here. So you can go and like listen to all like the details, our estimations and every cool stuff in his presentation later. But the main thing is that in 2022, we estimate that close to half of UAE properties, housing was owned by foreigners. So a huge foreign influx. And why is that? Well, there's hardly any taxes in UAE. So you don't avoid any taxes if you go there. Very importantly, Dubai is, like UAE is part of the CRS. So they will not, if you ask anybody, they will not be classified as a tax haven or anything, but they send banking information across borders, they comply with the CRS of the OECD, this information exchange, and for all like objective measures, they're compliant. They're not even, which is kind of disturbing, knowing the evidence I will show you later, not even on the like the watch list for money laundering. Through this international anti-money laundering agency. So this is kind of, it shows a discrepancy between real life and policy and what you can learn from when you look at the numbers. What we can also say is Dubai is a safe haven for tax evasion. So when we look at the Norwegians who are Norwegian tax residents who own properties in Dubai, 70% of them did not report it on their tax return. And in Norway, we have a wealth tax. So they're supposed to, and that's a global one. So they have to report it and pay wealth tax for every property they own globally. And this was not done. The journalists have looked at this in a different way, and we have even higher number of the tax evasion. This is not just in Norway, in UK as well. Like more than only 15%. Journalists found that only 50% of the massive number of UK residents who rented out a Dubai apartment at least once in the period, only 50% of them reported it to the HMRC, as the UK tax administration. So it's a very, seems to be a broad-placed, like easy way to get around legislation to hide. Also, journalists have documented a lot of, they have documented also that a lot of crime is connected. So it's not just taxes, but it's also a safe haven for crime. There's not few countries have good existing extradition agreements with Dubai. So as I say, if you get to Dubai with your money or yourself, you're pretty safe. And even looking at the Norwegian ones, where you can look at in detail, because this leak was also, this work for the media consortium was headed by a Norwegian. That's why we know a lot about that as well. Connected with drug smuggling, fraud, money laundering, assault, violence, all kind of criminality. So it's not just taxes. We are talking about systematic use of another entity to hide actions and to hide illicit money, basically. So tax evasion is very often connected to corruption, crime, terror financing, sanction avoiding, and criminality. They also found that of the Norwegian taxpayers, 20% of them had criminal record, and most of them did not report basically had any income or wealth on the tax return. This has been corroborated, the same pattern all over, like in many, many countries. The journalists go after and document criminal cases, mob, terror financing, all of that connected in a case-by-case basis, using our global estimates like as a background. Like you first have they show the global picture, and then they go and find the single cases. Another example, okay, sorry, Blueberry, I'm stealing your thunder with one more slide. We are looking at, okay, what happens then with the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, of the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine in 2022? Can we look at, so we know from, it seems to be an influx of Russians to Dubai. Can we also see that in the data? And also with utilizing data on purchases, so this is not the stock, this is just the inflow of new owners, we see a huge increase in Russians buying Dubai properties after the full-scale invasion in Dubai, in Ukraine, and after most of the world imposed a lot of sanctions, Dubai not, on Russia. So we estimated this to 6.3 billion in property. And this was also used later to see this. And this is not just this, we also see evidence on direct sanction, like terror financing, people put on the watch list in other countries, having property and being like pretty free life in Dubai. It also turns out to be a very safe haven for money laundering. So why do I care about this issue? Well, it's like taxes and tax evasion is very tied to other criminal activity that is super bad for many countries. We also see that, like we see owners from conflict states or very poor countries are overrepresented with properties in Dubai. And these are not the common people owning those properties we can expect when these are expensive prisons. So it's a tool to hide money and to cheat on your country, basically, I was saying. But how do we get that how can we prove that there's money laundering going on? And then I was not involved in this, just to be clear. Journalists have gone undercover to document this. So what the journalists they went undercover as buyers and were offered to buy properties, no questions asked, even in clearly illegal money. And now I'm gonna this is kind of high tech for me. I'm trying to change this directly when we talk. So journalists do a lot of work with a big risk of their own safety. And I'm really, really humble what they put themselves through with in order to pursue more information for us. So what's next then? Well, what the journalists found out is also that this is also a risk for investors. Do you know that what the company you are investing in is good? So the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, one of the biggest in the world, a lot of money, has had investments. It turns out in two Emara companies, also big property companies in Dubai, and made a lot of money on it. Big investments and big increases in value. And then journalists show that they let convicted criminals and people tied to all kind of bad stuff buy apartments. And based on this, politicians now call for the fund to withdraw from Dubai, and for the ethical committee, which the fund is not supposed to invest in very damaging behavior, but it doesn't mention taxes or fraud or anything. So there's been calling for the ethical committee to change the ways the guidelines they have for the big fund and where they are allowed to invest. Okay, but this is just one city. Why do we care just about Dubai? Well, we got data there, so of course, but it's also a very big player in the international real estate market. So we are also working on global estimates we can find, and then we have from six. If you have information and data for us, come to us and we put it, we are really working on trying to get global estimate, and we want to have estimates on country level on how much foreigners own in each country. And we see that London is a big market. A lot of foreign owners in London, but Dubai is also very big. This is in dollars, it's not in relative terms. And the big city is Singapore and Paris, and then we have a very small one in Oslo, but it's kind of, so it differs. So not every city will have this big part of foreign owners. Okay, next, if we get anything if we could get real estate included in this information exchange, in the CRS, is the problem solved then? Well, there are other types of assets. For instance, crypto, which used to be total secret, and now is a bit more and more information available. And I would just want to point you to a very cool paper that we have some Scatterfoss people doing, like Mona, Elvin, and Andreas is presenting later, and on where they basically use, it's not leaked, but there's data that suddenly were available through bankruptcy proceedings in the US. So when there was this crypto exchange that went bankrupt, suddenly everybody who had accounts there became creditors to that, and then the creditors were then made available. Using that data and merging it to admin data, they were able to show some really cool stuff Again, not stealing the thunder, just showing that as there was a lot of matches, they could actually match it to the admin data and show like this is the amount on the cryptocurrency, and you see like there's a lot of small but also some pretty big amounts held in the cryptocurrency, and they will also see whether or not they actually reported it on the tax return. And you see 40% of them did not report it on the tax return. So it's a big hidden wealth. What's also interesting is that you can also compare this then with the self-reported to surveys. And it seems like, just a spoiler, that the survey, what the information you get on crypto ownership in surveys is not exactly accurate. But you have to go and listen to Andreas to find out how. That's now later here. So, do we have to go abroad to have offshore wealth, like hidden wealth? Because do we know who owns everything in our countries? Most countries don't have shareholder registers, like complete updated shareholder registers. How do you know who owns a company? And what we see is also a big challenge now globally is in many countries, but also in the global, like shopping for taxes and like trying to reduce their effective tax rate, also among the very rich, the use of holding companies and retaining earnings in the companies, not paying it out, and still using it as a money box. Like money is power. Even if you don't have it in your own account, you can control it in many ways. And there's also very many ways you can get at money and use it for your own benefit in a company. And that's kind of getting more and more challenging. How do we tax capital income? Usually we tax it when it's paid out from a company. But how do we tax it when it is within the company sector? Companies are just tools. They're owned and managed by individuals who benefit from the activities. But they also offer a kind of layer of secrecy when we don't know who owns them. So the retained earnings is now a big challenge in that it is growing in many countries. Money kept in the company sector. How do we deal with that? We're thinking about it challenges our traditional way of thinking about taxing individuals. Like it's individual income when it's paid out, but it's in the firm and when it's not. And this is where I blame the lawyers. Because I've been on this complaint board for the oil taxation in Norway. And it was very enlightening because we as economists, many things that I as economists say, this is seriously, this is just crap, this is just tax avoidance. They're doing this just to avoid taxes. It's not real. But you can't crack down on it if the law doesn't open up for it. So the wording in the law is very, very important. And what it is what is a person? Well, I'm me. And you can trace me in all public registers across time, and often now also across countries by my personal identifier. I'm the same person, I'm a legal person. But a firm is also a legal person. But the firm is a legal person, a legal tax entity on its own. But it can change, it can move, and it's really difficult to find out and also hold a firm accountable, right? So you can use, and I'm not saying hide, but there's a lot of money in firms that's kind of difficult to deal with conceptually also for us. So that's a challenge. And you can also consume in the firm. You don't have to take money out to have nice yachts and houses and boats and all of that. And then that's also one of the papers we had with this current president. He did call it on Twitter, your most criminally undercited paper. Because where we actually can see and document that when they introduced the dividend tax in Norway, we didn't have one, amazingly not. And then introduced dividend tax, suddenly, bam, retained earnings went up. The firms stopped paying dividends, not at all. They paid dividends to companies, holding companies, but not to individuals. So you see retained earnings going up, just staying in the companies. And then suddenly we see that there seems to be an increase of yachts and airplanes and cars and all kind of stuff in the companies. There are rules for that. Whenever I talk to lawyers, they say, well, yeah, there are rules for that. Not reporting this would be cheating, but it's really difficult for the tax administration to control this. And they also have found, like, you look at the balance sheet, and when they go out and control it, it looks like a company car is listed as a company car in the balance sheet, and suddenly it is a nice boat. So there's very many ways you can get around that, and often the registers don't speak to each other. That's also a very big challenge when you want to audit and check and do it automatically. There's also that's misunderstood perception of GDPR in the public sector, preventing sharing of data across units. So it's very difficult to cross-check what we can do often, but they can't do the demonstrations. This has also implications for our perception of inequality. So when we measure inequality, we measure it when it's paid out to individuals. But if you don't pay it out, you just have it in the firm. You don't have that income then? So this is also with another presidential paper, where we look at the individuals, and then we basically see, since we have data on share ownership, we can actually see when income is earned in the firm, but not paid out as dividends. That's retained earnings. How does that correspond? So if you see here in Norway, we introduced a dividend tax in 2006. Bam! There seems to be a very change in the income composition of the rich. So this is the income composition, like the percentage of their total income that comes from different sources. The top 0.01% richest individuals, no, high income individuals, not rich. So what we see here is retained earnings. The yellow and the red are retained earnings in companies, but the red is in public companies, and the yellow is in non-listed companies. And then we have dividends paid out is in blue, and other income, usually wages, is in gray. So for the very rich, wages make out a very little part of their income. That we can observe on the tax return. We can also observe dividends on the tax return. That's the blue one. But when you introduce a dividend tax, they stop paying dividend. They still earn the money, they just keep it in holding companies, unlisted companies. And you see that they share this non-distributed earned income that year. Like this is the increase in not the stock of retained earnings, but the increase in retained earnings that year. That's not the income that's not distributed, increases. So the majority of the high income, the real high income individuals, have their income held in the companies. The yellow doesn't appear on the tax return, so they will appear pretty like as a normal guy with some wage income. This is a very big challenge also in how we understand and how we can advise policymakers. I'll spend the last minutes now on talking about, and then we have a couple of minutes for questions or whatever, and we can also talk more later. Because this has been kind of a journey in looking back. And there's been so many trials and errors. And I think I just want to, if you want to work with these, it's really cool to work with leaked data. It sounds cool. But there are things you might not think about in the beginning, and it's easy to keep things in mind. First of all, you have to have the legal parts correct. Because there is this ethical issue, like, should we really use leaked data? There's kind of stolen data. Can we use them? Should we use them? And in Europe, we have to comply with this GDPR. I can't remember what that is. It's just, if you say GDPR to a politician or anybody, public bureaucracy, they will just say, oh, it is dangerous, right? It's basically rules with data sharing and personal protection that we have to deal with. The problem is it sounds so scary. So usually if you have, that's the main problem. Most, like, it's left to low officials in the public sector to say whether this is okay or not. And it's usually so scary, people say just no, and then just stay away with using any personal data. We were working with some experts on the field to get this right when we worked into Dubai. We have to have the legal side and comply with GDPR. And there's a lot of, I wouldn't say wiggle room, but room in the GDPR one. And you can be a bit, but it depends on whether you want to look at the possibilities or the problems. GDPR opens up for using personal identifiable data, personal information. But you have to weigh the risk for the individuals that affected towards the gains for the society. You have to be aware of the risk. It doesn't say you shouldn't have any risk, but you have to deal with and identify and be aware of the risk. So there's big thinking about that and varying and have good structures in mind, limitation, data security, and all of that helps you. But also, how do you argue with this is good for the public good. And then the stories of the journalists that's been before, why this is important, why do we care about this project, is basically what you also need for arguing in a legal way why this is good for society and why the benefits outweigh the risk. And then you have to do all of this legal work. And then most universities have officers to help that, but you need really to go into and know the concepts yourself, because you're the only one who know the project, who know the data and can give data flow descriptions and give a real description on what's going on to help them. If you just come and say, can you help me, can you fix this, and just give them the paper or the project plan, you'll probably get no. It's a work and a dialogue you have to do with the lawyers and be forward-leaning and see the room. The next thing is that working with journalists, it's not a collaboration what we think of in the normal sense. It shouldn't be, because they have a different objective. You have to understand what are their objectives and what are your objectives and what are the limits you can dealing with. And you have to understand that there are things you shouldn't touch. So complying with GDPR, like I always say, okay, we can comment on their work in an early stage, but I cannot see a name. I will not see a name, I will not know cases, I will know structures. So we can talk about structures and problems and learn from each other, but never, ever, ever names. Like, don't put yourself in a position that's bad. So it's about working in parallel. You have projects, tracks that work in parallel. You interact as you would do if you work with a tax admin or anybody else, but it's not as working with a co-author. So you have to be very, have limits and strict and at the outset, and keep that in mind. So you work in parallel, you coordinate, you exchange information, insights, but insights and not data. Never share anything. So be very, very conscious about that and the roles. Then it's about data security. You have to have very, very, very good systems for data security, structures, being sure how you handle it, how and have and also it comes to, that also comes not to how you just do the data, but also your phone. I don't know if you all know that there's something called Pegasus, a spyware that you can get through, apparently through an SMS, and they can see all your phone and all of that. I felt like also, it was a very strange experience. I had worked with leaked data before on Panama and Swiss links, but not on the Dubai. So suddenly when the launch was closing, I had to go off my phone, we got burner phones. It sounds very dramatic, but it was super scary. Suddenly, being told, if you see something scary outside your house, you go and you call the police. Because you didn't know what was going on. We know that there in the past, so they would go after journalists, but also one security measure was that I would never comment on a single cases, only comment on patterns, not be in any of the cases. When they go after one person, a mobster or whatever, we don't appear the same case. We keep it separate. We only comment on numbers and we play down, because you don't want to be affiliated with somebody if somebody becomes angry. Or data. And then the university had to have extra data security measures in place as well, because there's data breach also is possible. Yes, I talked about that, but this also keeping the mind, be mindful. So we basically followed some of the same measures that the journalists did, but being mindful of your team members. That is actually a different type of risk involved, potentially. And I wasn't aware of that when we started. I hadn't thought about that, so it was kind of scary when it came. It all went well, but it's kind of a reality we're not faced with. Putting yourself out there, we want to change the world. I want to change the world, make it something better. And we talk against people who have a lot of money, a lot of lobbyists. In Norway, there's very rich people who want to get rid of the wealth tax. So whenever you speak out of the wealth tax, even if it's research-based, there's a risk of people going after you to discredit you instead of going into a fact-based discussion. There's lobbyists, there's a lot of lobbyists, there's a lot of people. So when you go into controversial things, there's the risk of seeing suddenly your picture on the front page of the newspaper with a very discrediting headline, basically lies. And that's scary to face as well. So it's important also to think about the risk of that and having a good structure in mind and having people around you and discuss that with your university is the potential of that. I'm not saying it's going to happen, I'm not scaring anybody, but putting your hat out there also means that you can get burnt. So that's also something to keep in mind. It's not very pleasant when it happens, but you get over it. So we will discuss this more in the next, we have a session here later, in the next session where we're going to discuss this in more detail, having great people who also work on the leaked, other type of leaked data join us in a panel discussion, and we hope to see many of you there. So thank you very much, and we have some time for questions, I was told. Thank you.
Friedrich Schneider, University of Linz. I wonder a bit why you do not use, or you didn't even mention any data you could get from shadow economy. By definition, in shadow economy, you have tax evasion, yeah, and it's not so small, yeah. So that would be a source one could use because it's now available for roughly 160 countries over 30 years, yeah. So in this respect, this might be another source to detect this and to see whether it matches with the other figures.
Yeah, thank you. So ask why I didn't use the, so there was a data source, the database you're talking about, the shadow economy database? Yes, I haven't used it, but I know of it. But yes, so there's many great sources and aggregate data and estimates out there, but that's also an estimate. So what I want to use is, when I'm talking about how to get new data to compare with existing estimates, but there's still estimates on how do you get comparable estimates across countries. So there's a great data source, statistics, and we have been working on the shadow economy also, collaborating with the tax admin and doing audits and randomized audits, but it's also combining with admin data, but it's also how do you measure it. So it's a great point and a great resource. Thank you.
So you talked about offshore wealth and different reasons why people have wealth offshore. So tax evasion is obviously one, but crime and corruption are others, and they are linked. But do you have some sense about like how important different reasons are? Because it's a combination of things, and like policy implications of criminals holding money abroad versus rich people holding money abroad are quite different.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like, how do we get at the motives? We're trying to get at it. It's difficult. And thank you for pointing that out, because I might be a bit like shadow and the hidden microphones and stuff. It's not illegal to hold offshore wealth. And it's for many, it's a very legit reason, right? If you're like, we see many from Lebanon owning properties in Dubai. And there's a reason for that. When your country breaks down and your money in the bank isn't worth anything, like you want to have them in a safe haven. Totally, it's not legal at all. So that's also like you want in conflict states. It's not just corrupt leaders having money, it's also people who want to secure their assets. They're not gone away. So yeah, so there are many legit reasons for it. We are working on getting at these reasons. And if you have some ideas, we're happy to look into it together.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Sorry. So one question I have is just on maybe some unintended effects of strengthening sort of the regimes to tackle this kind of behavior. Increasingly, there's concerns for governments that we need innovators for productivity growth, for innovation, and so forth. And increased tax rates, some people argue, may put off innovators. They may migrate. Have you done any sort of research on just the offshore wealth side and sort of innovation, or kind of link between that? Is it perceived as sort of increasing the tax burden and so may have similar effects, or do you think the behavioral effects are likely different?
That's a great question. I haven't looked at that. It's also very difficult to link because I can't link names. In Norway, I can link names through these encrypted identifiers in the Norwegian data, but linking the leaks to these data are very difficult and then to follow firms. So it's a challenge, but that's getting at the real effects you're talking about. Yeah, we can talk long about that issue later, but yeah. But it's an important question, but no, we haven't been able to do that. Now we're just trying to draw the map, basically.
Hi, I'm Mohammed Maran. I have a question. I just want to. I'm curious about your opinion about that. Suppose I'm an individual who's a tax evader,
yeah,
but I live in a country where property rights or let's say the government is not very benevolent towards the individuals. So I cheat on the government, but for the reason that I want to protect my private property. So would your, let's say, atlas help those governments in retrieving the wealth or the capital of these individuals to expropriate them?
So we have no names in the atlas. We have estimates, like total numbers. But one of the main challenges is, like you're pointing at, this is also pointing at the motives for hiding wealth that Wojciech was coming at. But information isn't enough, so taking a step back from that. So we have many, there's big corruption, and many developing countries have seen huge amount of wealth. You say Angola, like the rulers have basically stolen so much from their people. You know it's there. How do you get it back? So that's basically when I was at the opening of the CRS, they were taking, OECD said bank secrecy is dead. And the emerging economy says, yes, information is good, but we need to get the money back. That's the next step. How do you get the money back? So this is the opposite of what you asked, though. You said that people are hiding because they're afraid of literally taking away, but even illicit funds are hidden away and it's claimed and it's like somebody else's, how do you get it back? So, yeah, but it's an ethical question we're raising. It's difficult, so.